What's up, everybody? It's that time again for some big, meaty game development content. I'm making a game I do a poor job describing, which is what I'm going to do right now. It's sort of an emergent gameplay RPG inspired by games like Kenshi and Dwarf Fortress, with an economy and an ecosystem, and adventure with character art inspired by games I played as a kid, with 3D characters rendered into 2D sprites. So last time we kicked our procedural generation up a notch by adding sticks and stones and some terrain features, and suddenly we're getting some semblance of an aesthetic. Now, typically I like to make some general improvements on something and then not touch it for a year and a half while I focus on something else, repeating this cycle over and over again for an eternity in this sort of Grecian tragedy I've engineered to become my life. But man, this procedural generation stuff just tickles me pink, and you gotta do what feels right, folks. You gotta. Our triplanar mapping is blending textures together, and I don't like it. So we'll have the shader reference a noise map when it's blending instead. Here I am cycling through some random textures I already had to illustrate what's happening. This gives us a nice hard line that makes more sense for our pixelated style. Next, I had this awful issue with world props hovering in the air anytime the terrain was even remotely steep. See, I was adding props to the terrain just by selecting vertex locations, throwing a tree on that bitch and letting it sit. The problem came when I went to offset the position of the object so everything doesn't appear like a grid. It seems obvious if you think about it for even one second, but you can't actually use the vertex positions alone to calculate a position along the surface of a mesh. The second approach, I instead looked at each individual triangle, composed of 3 different vertices. With those positions, we can perform some triangular mathematics to get a random position that's always along the triangle, giving us surface-perfect object locations. With the additional data, we can also calculate the slope of the triangle and prevent trees from spawning if the slope is too steep, which is a pretty tree-like thing to do, I think. I'm not really an expert. Next, the terrain itself was a little too standard for my liking. I created a system to blend layers of noise together to create a slightly more interesting noise, and the results were slightly more interesting. This of course wasn't quite varied enough, so I added some more noise to modulate the height, creating pseudo-biomes, which worked perfectly the first time, and the second time, and then eventually it worked perfectly again, except for some kind of off by 1 error creating these gaping holes. With that driving me temporarily insane, I decided to have a short break and take the fellows from Patreon for a walk since they needed some exercise. Man, look at all these sights. We're gonna have so much fun here one day, boys. 2035 can't come fast enough, am I right, fellas? We'll probably want to blend these together at some point, but this terrain holes are making it impossible for the time being. Instead, I adjusted my focus to the trees and rocks, which looked a bit out of place, which I'm sure has nothing to do with my 3D models. Luckily, math has already largely solved art as a problem, and we can leverage it as a crutch. Using a similar approach to the shader with our landscape, we can add a top-down texture to our props based on their position, and also blend it with noise. Here I can adjust the variable to, embossing the rock. Or, if the rock is up in the mountains, we can add snow. You can see how we might manipulate this variable for weather effects in the future should I, by the grace of God, continue living for another 10 years. It's completely dynamic, so we can see the rock change its state as I adjust its height. First snow at the mountaintops, then moss, and finally sand. And since we use glorious computer science instead of disgusting art, we can rotate the rock any way we want and it'll always work. Of course, it works for the trees as well. I just did something f***ed up with the UVs on the model, so the effect doesn't quite look as good, but we'll fix it, boys. Moving on, handwriting the prop spawning code was starting to waste time, so I refactored the entire thing into a system of virtual ropes and pulleys that let me easily alter the entire operation through the user interface. Here I made giant rocks appear only on cliff faces. Sure, this looks ridiculous, but you can imagine it looking better with actual dedicated assets, can't you? It was so easy with the new system anyone could do it without knowing a thing about computer programming, as if anybody except for myself would ever be adjusting these values. Who knows, maybe modders will make use of this someday, but I doubt it. Of course, it does speed up the process for me as well, so it should save me some time in the long run when you consider how long this run is. With all this in place, we're on our way to some halfway serviceable landscapes. Anyways, thanks a lot for all the support on Discord, YouTube, and Patreon. The comments, the likes, really gets me fucking pumped. Subscribe, please. Till next time, peace out, everybody.
The only failure is never freaking trying in the first place, being too chicken shit to load the bar up and go for freaking broke.